quizzes several characters, again, each with their own unique perspective, but the storyteller's viewpoint will remain constant. Thus, it is important to realize that the point of view for a story is linked to the narrator of that story. As you read a story, you will see the story from the narrator's point of view. After all, that is just how an oral story would work. If you were telling a story to one of your friends, they would hear and see the story from your viewpoint. That sometimes gets a little tricky for parents and teachers when they have to settle a dispute and they have to decide who's telling what from what perspective. When two people are arguing or fighting over a matter, it is because the two antagonists have those differing viewpoints. The parents or teacher must listen to both individuals and decide the right course of action from their own viewpoint. That is not easy to do. So when an author writes his story, he must have a consistent perspective from which to tell the story, and that consistent perspective is provided by the narrator. In literature, there are three basic points of view that can be used. You read about each in the thinking zone, but I want to give you just a little more detail about each one. First, I'm going to mention the first-person point of view. The narrator is a character within the story. He may be a minor character, one of the major characters, or the protagonist himself. This point of view is probably the easiest to determine, primarily because the language of the story will use first-person grammar. Obviously, he will use first-person pronouns whenever the narrator is speaking of himself or the narration of the story as it relates to himself. That is just the way you tell a story to a friend or family member, right? And of course, the grammar number and tense must also match the first-person narration. Since first-person narration is given from a single point of view, then the information to be presented is limited. With the French fry example of perspective I gave at the beginning of the lesson, you could only know what was going on from my perspective. In the end, that resulted in a little irony because of the information I chose to share with you, and that resulted in your quizzes and the unit test. That is why you want to do your absolute best on these worksheets for this project, and why you will need to have your facilitator give you feedback from the grade or limited knowledge. While the information is limited, the knowledge of the narrator character, or the author himself, if he happens to be the narrator, grows. The reader will not only see the story from his viewpoint, but he will become intimately familiar with his opinions, thoughts, habits, and beliefs. This deepens the realism of that character. Another way a first-person narrative may add this depth is for the author to use an approach known as stream of consciousness. This is when the narration is written to simulate the direct, unaltered thoughts from the narrator's mind. While this format can be confusing to write, and even to read, the revealed depth of the narrator character is intense. The remaining 2 points of view fall under the category of third-person point of view. The first of these 2 types is the third-person omniscient. Now, where have you heard the term omniscient before? That is typically used to describe an attribute of God. We say God is omniscient. But what is meant by that? Well, omniscient means all-knowing. And it is an accurate picture of who God is and what he knows and understands. However, if the term is used in literature to describe a story's point of view, it is not saying that the story or the author is godlike. Rather, it is saying that within the context of the written world of that particular story, the narrator knows and describes everything. He is able to accurately describe every character's actions as well as their inner motives. He can even relate the details of an event at which he was not present. In real life, only God is omniscient. But in the world of fiction, the author or narrator can be all-knowing. And one thing, an omniscient narrator can also provide completely objective commentary of the story and the characters. This is not possible with other points of view. Because the narrator knows and sees all, he can naturally present the greatest amount of information. In some stories, that is the best approach. but in other stories, the author may want to keep some things hidden from his readers. In those cases, the author could use a third-person limited omniscient perspective. This differs from the omniscient in one basic way. The narrator is omniscient about only one character. Rather than having full knowledge of every detail, the narrator knows everything about one character. He knows every action, every thought, and every motive. As for other characters, he sees them as he would any other person. What he can see with his own two eyes is the limit of his knowledge. This perspective can be best used if the author wants to present a clear flow of events without creating all sorts of distractions with every single detail. It is a lot less confusing both to write and to read. To sum these characteristics up for you, I want you to ask yourself, how do I determine the point of view in a given story? Do you think you know how? It is a lot easier than most analysis you will do in literature. Essentially, you will just ask 3 different questions. First, who tells the story? Then ask yourself, how much is this narrator allowed to know? And finally, to what extent does the narrator reveal the inner thoughts and feelings of other characters? If you will supply answers to those 3 basic questions, you will be able to determine the point of view of any work. And to wrap up this lesson, that is exactly what I want you to do. I want you to look at some of the previous works from our textbook and use them as examples of point of view. I will show you the title of the story and a passage from that story that reveals the point of view.
Okay, finally, we need like 2 more people to join. And then we can finally start again. Oh, when 1 more person joins.
Today's generation be like. Oh my god, why am I so tall? I wish I was shorter. I look like a grandma. Or a man. I wish I was shorter. So others would view me as gentle. Oh wow, she is so tall. I wish I was as tall as her. But unfortunately I'm short. Sometimes people confuse me for a little kid. I bet she never has these kinds of problems. Well, what can I do about it? Oh wow, her eyes are so beautiful. They reflected the sun. They look magical. I wish I had her eyes. Her hair is so pretty. She has curly hair. I wish I did as well. But my hair is straight. And it has no volume. It gets greasy fast as well. Why do others get what I want? Why can't I have her naturally beautiful hair? We always compare ourselves to others, but never
What do you know about the great detective Sherlock Holmes? I'm hoping that to answer that question, you are not relying on one of the many actors who have played the character of Sherlock Holmes over the past century. If you are, you probably have an inaccurate image of who this man really was. Actually, even that statement is inaccurate. You see, Holmes was not a man. He was a work of fiction. The author did state that his character detective was based on a real-life professor of his, Dr. Joseph Bell. Doyle had worked for Bell and had come to admire his abilities of observation. Still, the Holmes character is based on Bell's abilities, not his actual personality and habits. Therefore, Doyle always maintained that Holmes was fictional and was meant to be contained within the stories that Doyle had created. Holmes was so popular that Doyle's publishers couldn't print enough books to meet the demand of the reading public. And when Doyle decided to kill off his famous detective in a story, he was met with a barrage from dissatisfied customers who were devastated by their loss. The outcry was so great that Doyle brought Holmes back from the dead in yet another series of short stories. Following Doyle's lifetime, the rights to his character became available. Since that time, at least 100 different actors have portrayed the famous detective in movies, plays,